Dr. Bush is going to give us an update on the clinical and epidemiologic aspects. After that, we have a very interesting presentation by the team from OneBlood on plasma therapy from convalescent patients. We've heard a lot about that on and off, but it's just about here and real. And these are the folks that are going to be involved in collection, processing, and distributing the specimens. So that is brand new news we're going to be getting from the OneBlood team. And then Jeff is going to give us an update on any of the regulatory issues. And Jared Fowler is going to give us an update on the regulatory news and financial news, particularly regarding the CARE Act and how we can go about accessing the various federal programs. So with that in mind, why don't we have Dr. Bush give us his update.
Thank you, Dr. Giffler, and thank everybody for attending and listening to this. I'm going to give a brief 10-minute slide presentation on some information since our last virtual meeting last week. So this is, in essence, first I'm going to start with statistics. So this is as of 8 o'clock this morning. In the whole country, 311,533 cases, 54 deaths, which is a mortality rate of 2.7%. And remember, that's a mortality in people who've been diagnosed. Obviously, there are many people who are not diagnosed. Therefore, the total mortality rate for COVID-19 in this country is unknown. But even as Anthony Fauci says in his New England Journal of Medicine editorial this past week, but doesn't say it in public, is he believes in the end, if you tested everybody in the country, the mortality rate will be somewhere between 1 and 0.1%. He says closer to 0.1%. If you look at just Florida, 11,544 cases as of 8 o'clock this morning, 195 deaths that we know of, 1.6% mortality. Again, that's of people who've been tested and diagnosed. How about those who are ill, not tested, or those who are asymptomatic and infected, not tested? If you go back to the U.S. numbers, you can see that 80% of all cases in the U.S. come from basically 10 or 11 states, New York, New Jersey, Michigan, California, Louisiana, Massachusetts, Florida's there in the middle. You can also see that Washington's moving down the list because what they've done seems to be effective as far as social distancing and other things like that. When you get to Florida, about 73% of cases come from a handful of counties: Miami-Dade, Broward, Palm Beach, Orange, Hillsborough, Duval, and Lee. Places where you would almost expect, because this was an imported disease, and therefore local transmission can't occur in parts of the country or states or counties where it wasn't initially imported into. So it's obvious why those areas have the most cases and should get the most attention. Let's just look at the trending case numbers. So this is off the CDC, World Health Organization, USA data. We're starting on March 27th, going down to yesterday's data, ending on last evening at midnight. If you look at it, you can see the total number of cases that are increasing, obviously, and it's obviously tripled since March 27th till April 4th, at the end of April 4th. Well, for obvious reasons. Either there's a lot more transmission or we're testing a lot more folks. I think it's the latter, because if you look at the right-hand column, number of new cases, you can see that the number of new cases every day obviously is increasing. Over the past 3 days or 4 days, statistically, that's probably within the realm of the same. And that's in the face of testing many, many more people. Because as you know, some places have rapid tests, others are still using slower tests. So having said that, if you look at the so-called exponential growth, that's not an exponential number that's occurring on those numbers. That's a sequence of local transmission and more testing, but it's not exponentially rising. I look at that as the glass half full as opposed to half empty. I don't see the exponential. But having said that, you can see how many critical care beds are there per capita for selected countries. And although the USA takes a lot of hit for not being prepared, you can see per capita, there's more critical care beds in this country than anywhere else. And if you look at the other countries with less mortality, such as Germany, they also have the increased amount of critical care beds compared to Spain, who has at least 1/3 or less than we do. And they're testing mostly people who are very sick. I know that for a fact. than as opposed to people who are coming in and going home from ERs or walk-in clinics. They're not doing that in Spain. You can't walk into an ER and say, I want to be tested because I have an upper respiratory tract infection. And then if you look at China, where this started, and India, a lot less critical care beds. But having said that, you know, the negative predictions are severe hypoxic respiratory failure in an ICU that are predicted for this country are numbers such as that. Whether we'll get there or not, that's the American Hospital Association. I personally don't think so, but obviously time is going to tell. And if that's true, then how do we really know how this is transmitted? Well, this is a respiratory transmitted disease. And of course, droplets, either droplet or airborne, can get on fomites or surfaces or clothing. As far as stool and perinatal transmission, yes, it's possible, but it's not something I think we really need to take into consideration. Which brings us to how quickly and when do people shed viruses? Well, viral shedding is greatest at the time of symptom onset. This comes from the New England Journal of Medicine, very recently published. They look at the viral loads in 17 symptomatic patients. They looked at both throat swabs, which are the darker ones, and nasal swabs. It shows you obviously nasal swabs are more accurate. There's no data regarding the duration of replication competent virus shedding. In other words, just because you can test positive for PCR, is the virus really growing by culture? And that's an unknown. So many of the things we're doing here are unknown, but you can see that the days since onset of symptoms, drastically the shedding drops by PCR isolation as you move along. And also, remember, we're doing real-time qualitative PCR, not quantitative. When we talk about measuring a viral load with hepatitis C or hepatitis B or HIV, we're actually measuring copies. If you just want to know if somebody's infected with hepatitis B, you can just do a qualitative or let's say an example, HIV is a better example, a qualitative RNA test. It doesn't tell you how many copies. And right now, our detection of copies is 20. So if you're less than 20 copies RNA, HIV, you're considered undetectable. And the government says you're untransmissible. Well, that would mean that if you're 19, you're not transmissible. And if you're 21, you're potentially transmissible. Same thing goes for here. How many copies of PCR are really being detected far out on that curve? That's another unknown. Which brings us to the many unclear, unknown facts about transmission. And I listed them. Does exposure to the virus lead to active infection to everybody? It used to be said that rabies is 100% fatal, but you can find a host of people with antibody to rabies who have never had clinical disease. It was also said that 70% or 50% of people who contracted Ebola died. In a Lancet article after the outbreak in Liberia, they showed that a large portion of the population had IgG antibodies, were never sick. So maybe that's not true. How many acquire infection remain asymptomatic? Well, we'll know that later on by convalescent serologic testing. When after acquisition does one become symptomatic? How would you know if they don't become symptomatic and if we're not testing asymptomatics? When after acquisition does the PCR test become detectable? Same dilemma. Does any PCR test mean you're contagious? Well, I just gave you the example for HIV. Are symptomatic infected persons more contagious? Well, obviously they are, but when do they become less contagious? When does a symptomatic or a recovered person stop shedding? Well, that's the recommendation of 3 days, no fever, 7 days from symptomatology onset. Theoretically, you can go out into the world. Whether that's true or not, we're going to find out. And there's recommendations from the country and from the state. When does an asymptomatic person stop shedding virus? Again, a test we're not going to know. So how can we place so much blame on the understandable delay in testing availability? How can you test for something you didn't have a test for? Which makes a lot of sense to me. And I don't think we should lay blame on the fact that we haven't tested, because the truth is we're testing more people in this country than any other country in the world. So let's look at this example. This was in the MMWR, which is a publication of the CDC recently. And this looked at the Diamond Princess ship. And what they found was out of 3,711 passengers and a crew, 19.2% or 712 tested positive for having shown that they were exposed to this virus, whether they were symptomatic or asymptomatic. But you can see on the top left, almost half of them, 331 of the 712 of those who tested positive, were asymptomatic when they were tested, meaning, yes, asymptomatic people can have positive PCR. If they're shedding it and contaging people, that's an unknown. Statistical modeling, however, suggests that almost 20% of infected in this study, 17.9, never develop symptoms. Well, these are things that we have to factor into when we're talking about closing down things, social distancing, when can people go back to work, what's essential and what's not. Well, other than PCR testing, what do we have? Well, you may not know this, and possibly or hopefully you do, is that just this week, a day or so ago, the FDA approved under an EUA, that's an expedited or expanded utilization access. A company called Cellex has a serologic test, and it goes like this. It's a 5-minute to 10-minute, or 15-minute rapid test using a drop of blood or serum. So you can use it from their finger, you can use it from blood that you already have in the lab. What's the data provided that allowed the FDA to approve this test? Well, they looked at 128 individuals who tested positive by PCR. And out of those, 120 or 94% either had IgM, IgG, or both by this simple test. What does that mean? That means it's a very sensitive test. There aren't very many false negatives. In this test, there were 6% false negatives. 8 people who had it failed to have a positive serologic test. And that could be for a reason of when do they turn positive? When did you collect their PCR? Secondly, out of the 250 individuals who had a negative PCR test, 239 by the serologic test were also negative. That's a 96% specificity. In other words, how specific is this test for this disease? Very specific. But the questions that go unanswered, when do you become positive serologically after infection? Well, you wouldn't know that because we don't know exactly when your PCR becomes positive. Number 2, what degree of protection do you really have from these antibodies and for how long? Well, we know the reason we have a high-dose flu vaccine is because elderly people getting the routine flu vaccine, although they produce IgG antibodies, they're not as protective in the 75-year-old as they are in the 45-year-old. Therefore, we give them a higher dose vaccine to boost their IgG titer. So we don't know what titer here is going to be protective in the short term and long term. And then finally, how long do these antibodies remain positive in you? And does that mean you've cleared the virus? But going forward, does that mean you can't be reinfected with this virus? Well, we all know there's certain diseases that we have IgG antibodies to, Lyme disease example, where you can become reinfected. The bottom line is, yes, this is very helpful, but the future of where these are going to be used is still not known. And as of today, a patient who tests positive or negative for this still has to have a PCR test. And if you're going to use this serologic test, the government requires that you still report your positives by this serologic test. This is what it looks like. Look at the test at the right. You put the drop of blood in that little red dot where it says sample. You have the C means the control is positive. The blood moves up there like a litmus paper. The serologic test is impregnated into that litmus paper. And you can see on the left hand, this was done at a hospital where I work. We did this yesterday. We took a positive patient down there called BJ, who's on a ventilator. She's been positive in the hospital for about 10 days. I don't know when she became symptomatic at home, but you can see her IgM and IgD tests are both positive. The fact that the IgM bar is a lighter color than the IgG, that's just the way the color coding is here. If you look at RC, who is a patient admitted to rule out COVID, his PCR test was negative, and you can see his serologic test was positive. This is very encouraging, and it's very rapid, and it's very cheap. This company who provided this one selling these for $8 a piece, and if you buy bulk, they're cheaper. How about protective covering? Well, that's a big, what's gone on with this? What are the controversies and conflicts about masks, and what are the recommendations? Well, when you're talking about masks, you're really talking about something that covers your face and your nose. We're talking about surgical masks, N95 masks, and any cloth that covers your face. Surgical masks basically keep you both from spreading organisms or secretions, and N95 means that anything that's floating in the air that's less than 5% microns, it filters out 95% of them. A cloth mask isn't necessarily going to do that, but the main thing here is, are you talking about spread or acquisition? Are you talking about droplet isolation or airborne? We know that things like are airborne, varicella zoster, measles, German measles, tuberculosis. You need a negative pressure wound because the small droplet particles float in the air for a long time, and therefore they can be inhaled when you're not in the droplet zone, which is described as 6 feet. When you're talking about spread, why should anybody wear a mask outside? It's because if they're asymptomatically infected and therefore they're able to spread it respiratory wise, those large droplets won't be spread from their airway and therefore they can't become airborne. As far as somebody walking around and about outside with a mask of any kind or a cloth, that's not necessarily going to stop acquisition because we don't even know how much would disperse in the air. Remember, in an N95 mask, they're filtered in a HEPA filter, and the negative pressure room has to take that air and put it somewhere after filtering it. They put it outside. So all these things are sort of unknown, and therefore all the controversy on should the CDC have recommended masks. Well, of course, for any respiratory disease, we use either droplet-type masks, what we call surgical, or N95, what we call airborne. But as far as the general public, yes, you potentially can cut down the spread if everybody covers their face with a cloth, because if they're asymptomatic, they won't drop the droplets and potentially aerosolize them as they move along. You know, how much does the virus live on surfaces? Well, these are experimental studies. Does it really matter? The bottom line is, who knows? You can see these experimental studies that were published in the Journal of Hospital Infection. And what do those hours really mean? What it really means is wash your hands and disinfect the surfaces, because that's such common sense. And how can you overdo it? Let's get to the last thing, social distancing, the science of social distancing. And this was a National Health Center or Academy of National Sciences presentation by Dr. Messonnier, who's a director there, and these are from the CDC. If you look at the linkage to the wholesale market in China and how that dissipated, and this became transmission locally, it's obviously respiratory and fomites. If you look at the World Health Organization phases and the CDC intervals, top and bottom there, you have 3 basic mechanisms here: containment, intensify finding, contact tracing, isolate and quarantine, characterize illness, and non-pharmaceutical interventions, which brings us to transmission outpaces containment efforts. Yes, if you don't do containment efforts, which brings us to mitigation, which is what we have to do to get this under control. Well, since we don't have the antivirals and vaccines that we know of that are effective right now, we have to go to non-pharmaceutical interventions. And if you do that, you can see with or without these protective measures, the curve drastically changes and our healthcare system capacity can be kept under control, or the need for that can be kept under control. So non-pharmaceutical interventions, or NPIs, or social distancing is what's recommended. And there's a lot of controversy about that. In fact, if you look at the CDC publication recently, the worldwide sentiment that travel restrictions and self-isolation may not stop COVID-19. These are the consensus from different countries, and the U.S. is right there in the middle. Some of them think this is not useful, and others, such as Japan, think it's very useful, or India think it's very useful, and Australia think it's very useful. And what's interesting is if you look at the mortality rate in some of the countries that are shifted to the right there and think it's useful, particularly Australia, they have a much lower mortality rate. So then social distancing. These are models of uninfected persons, infected persons, persons who recovered from infection. On the bottom, you can see if there's no strategy, forced quarantine, modest social distancing, or significant social distancing. And look at the infected persons. Just look at the green mountain, the red mountain. Obviously, if there's significant social distancing far on the right there, it works. So if we follow those things that have those dark dots on them on the left, it's just intuitive that this makes sense and should work. Now, how much you mandate that, that's a whole different political discussion. There are epidemiologic models of studies supporting social distancing in workplaces. When we look at the influenza models, this is CDC data that's published in the British Medical Journal. And if you look at social distancing here and the implementation on mitigation for coronavirus compared to influenza virus and other pandemics, that is what always has worked. Because remember, the pre World War II experiment is you didn't have very many vaccines or antivirals that were very effective. Now, is the public doing this? Well, the left-hand graph is bars, the right-hand graph is airports. The yellow is 2019 data. The blue is 2020 data. And obviously, as time goes on, yes, they're doing it. People are doing it. Bars, you can see the blue line dropping. airports, the blue line is dropping, which brings us to the final minute here, treatment. Well, what we know is that we don't know. What we know is that antiviral medications are going to be helpful. Vaccines are going to be preventable. Anti-inflammatories are just not known at this case. You know, I'm sure the people who originally had the patent on hydroxychloroquine wish they had it now, because as everybody says, the studies are going to be hard to do because most people are not enrolling in randomized controlled trial studies for obvious reasons, and the drug's being prescribed for anybody who's diagnosed positive, or at least who's waiting for a test to see if they're positive. You know, as far as prophylaxis, that's a whole different can of worms. Remdesivir, which has antiviral effect, it's an RNA polymerase inhibitor. You know what they say, follow the money if you want to know the truth. And if you look at Wall Street, the company who makes remdesivir, in the face of the stock market falling, they're drastically rising. So somebody on Wall Street thinks that drug's going to prove effective. We're going to hear about IVIG, or pooled gamma globulin. Well, we've done that for years for hepatitis A. That's a model that's worked. What would it work for this? We've done it for newborns with hepatitis B. That works. Interleukin-2 inhibitors, there's a group of monoclonal antibodies trials going on. JAK2 inhibitors, there's a trial going on for that. Corticosteroids are recommended against unless you're in the late stage of ARDS. You know, the information on angiotensin converting enzymes and inhibitors and receptors is plus and minus, and the controversy about non-steroidals is ongoing. So I know Dr. Rivkes is not on here, but I'm going to close with this comment, which is a personal aside. You know, when things go bad, people at the top always either get praised or criticized. Most often they get criticized because nobody tells you how good you're doing. People like to tell you how badly you did. You know, as fate would have it, it's interesting when you look at certain epidemiologic events. I don't know how, but somehow I've been involved. If you look at surgeon generals and local healthcare officials, somehow fate would have it for me that I've been involved with a lot of them. In 1982, I was a resident in the ICU at Pennsylvania Hospital, and Luther Turry, I don't know if you remember him, he was the Surgeon General of the United States, who in 1968 spent years trying to get the packet warning on cigarettes, saying that cigarette smoking can cause cancer. And that information was known for a long time, but he could not get that on the pack. I met him. I was his resident in the ICU when he was admitted for a pulmonary disease secondary to his prior cigarette smoking, which is very interesting. C. Everett Koop, who's also a Surgeon General who I heavily respected. And remember, you only remember the names of the people who were involved either because they did something great or because people want to criticize them. C. Everett Koop was the Surgeon General who really was outspoken about pediatric testing for HIV disease and what we're going to do about it, and testing pregnant women. He was trained as a pediatrician, just as our Surgeon General in the state of Florida, Dr. Rivkes is. C. Everett Koop, the Surgeon General of the United States at that time, early in the HIV or AIDS epidemic, trained at Pennsylvania Hospital where I did, but he's not my contemporary. He's older than I am. How about other ones? Well, Jean Malecki and now Alina Alonso. Jean Malecki was heavily involved in the anthrax in 2001 when she had the bold move to close the AMI building when the CDC did not want to do that, but she got support of the state Surgeon General right here in Florida. And I believe that Dr. Rivkes, who's also an academic trained pediatrician, along with the governor and the state, who are coming out with their guidelines, what we all get, are doing a great job here. And I would follow them. So remember, reporting of post-positive and negative cases are told by the health department. Return to work criteria has also recently been put out by the health department of the state and local, and additional requirements for healthcare workers, EMTs, and paramedics of what they also need when they can go back to work. And of course, as we know, that what changed the world is sanitation and immunization, and that's what's going to change the world here with COVID-19. Thank you for listening. I'll take questions if anybody wants to ask them. I know I went over time, but then I have to excuse myself because I got to go round at the hospital right now. I'm a little bit late, but thank you.
Are there any questions then for Dr. Bush before he leaves? Otherwise, we will move on our program.
Hey, Larry, Mark Daubertine here. You know, they're talking about this PCR test having about a third false negatives. I just was wondering, is there any thoughts on what the outcomes are on people that subsequently test positive? Are their outcomes worse? And what about transmissibility? Sometimes there's a false sense of security, and I just was wondering what your thoughts are with regard to that at home or at work or things like that.
Well, that's a great question, because, you know, people, I've always wondered, when somebody tests negative, that's like the biopsy negative cancer that should have cancer, or the Lyme disease patient I have who has negative serologies, and they tell me I don't know about negative serology Lyme disease. And I ask them, well, how did you actually define the disease? So in the PCR positive negative people who they say tested negative, I think what they're referring to is that later on they become symptomatic, or a subsequent test becomes positive. And to me, that speaks to the point that the PCR may not always be detectable, and depending on how many tests you do and when it turns positive. But having said that, I think there's a sampling error, like there is with anything. It's like what, you know, Dr. Giffler can speak to this. When an orthopedic surgeon gives you a 0.2 millimeter sample of osteomyelitis in the tibia, and you say there's no obvious acute osteomyelitis in the 0.2 millimeters they provided you. Let me give you one example. We have a woman in the hospital right now who's been on a ventilator for 10 days. Her LabCorp PCR test on admission came back positive. Now, it took us 9 days to get it back. At the same time, the hospital was trying to now send labs to the test, PCR tests to the state, because our turnaround time from LabCorp was slow, and we were trying to move people, or for logistics of the hospital. Well, that test came back 2 days, and that's just yesterday, 2 days after we sent it, and we sent it on Thursday, and the state reported it as negative. That would either imply that the LabCorp test was a false positive, or the state's test is a false negative, or that she cleared the virus while she still has significant infiltrates on the ventilator and is doing poorly, or that the test collection from the admission sample, which was done in an emergency room, done by the emergency room physician, compared to the sample obtained by the nurse in the ICU, was not as good a sample when obtained in the ICU. I think it's a false negative from the state because the sample wasn't adequate. So having said that, I don't know how to take that false positive. I wouldn't call any positive a false, take that false negative. I wouldn't refer to any false positive. What will be interesting to see is how the serologic test correlates. I hope that answers it in a long way.
Thank you. Dr. Bush, I know you have to leave. A quick question. Do you have a good estimate? We've heard some people give estimates in approximately 1 month. When do you think the peak will be here and start to level off and decline?
I agree what you're hearing from the CDC folks on the updates we're getting every day. Is I think the peak's going to happen in the next 2 to 3 weeks, and then it's going to decline. But I think we control the peak. It's in our hand. If we really isolate, contain, and then mitigate, I think the peak will be faster and it will be slower. And I think the estimates of how many ICU beds and how many ventilators we're going to need hopefully are going to be overestimated. When I look at that curve and the rate of new cases and the rate of new mortality rates, I find it hard to believe we're going to get to 100,000 or 200,000 people who die from this. But you know, maybe that's more my optimism than it is reality. But thank you.
Last question, quick question from Dr. Petit.
There was a report this morning about ivermectin, active against stopping the virus. What are your thoughts on that?
You know, there are some other parasitic medications. You know, ivermectin is used for things like strongyloidiasis, neurocysticercosis. So I think that those drugs are interesting. They have some in vitro activity. We've known that for a lot of these medications, but what it really turns out to clinically, I don't know. I think right now, hydroxychloroquine is the one I would be most using. And, you know, as we hear all the time, it's a doctor-patient decision. Obviously, we'd like to have clinical trials. I don't think you're going to see a lot of robust clinical trials of ivermectin, because I think the companies who are going to invest in clinical trials and the entities who are going to spend their resources doing them and the patients are going to go for what looks best. I think that's going to be things like IVIG, which we're going to hear about, remdesivir, some of the monoclonal antibodies that are anti-inflammatory, and hydroxychloroquine.
Thank you very much again, Dr. Bush.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Before we go to our next scientific presentation, is Mr. Santorio on the call to tell us what he knows about the field hospital?
So we have been working with the Department of Emergency Management for the state as well as DOH to try and plan for accommodating a mobile field hospital. There is one structurally erected right now near the Fort Lauderdale Executive Airport. It has the capacity to go up to about 250 beds. The majority of those beds are being planned to accommodate COVID positive, right? So the hospital is going to be COVID positive. The plan is to accommodate lower acuity med surge type, potentially tele patients. I believe there was also a plan in the works to do a 12-bed ICU, but after we got involved and started talking to DEM, it was our recommendation as the health system that was tapped on the shoulder to partner with them not to do that, specifically because the capacity that we have, and we're on actually a 3-county call daily now for surge planning with all the hospital CEOs. What we identified is that the number of beds that we have in our systems that are available but not staffed are pretty significant. So, for example, at Broward Health, I can use us for an example. We can staff up to about an additional 102 beds right now. But if we had additional staff, we could probably get another 400 out of that. Similar with Jackson, Memorial has even more than that. So our recommendation was we have some pretty consistent models going on right now, algorithms based on epidemiological studies that include some of the factors such as social distancing, travel bans, school closures, et cetera. Some of that looped in. In the early stages of this, the algorithms were a little bit all over the map and the confidence levels were relatively low because there were small numbers. Where we're at now in terms of the numbers, we're able to, some of these algorithms are honing in on more central numbers, so they all agree with each other. There is a 90% confidence level. So for example, in Broward County, we know that with a 90% confidence level, we can expect the surge to bring a census of an additional 300 or so ICU patients. The reason we're still going forward with the mobile hospitals, however, is that 10% variable, if that delta is a huge differentiator. So it goes from 300 to over 1,000. So what we're planning on doing is setting up the mobile hospital so that it can be operationalized to offload acute care COVID positive, but not ICU needing patients. They can accommodate, right now the plan is up to 250. We'll be working with the vendors to probably build that. We're gonna assemble a team probably in the next 48 hours to come in and help to operationalize it. They're also putting a few up in Miami as well. I think the intent is that these will be structurally built with the intent of not using them. And I don't know that they will have, the staff from an efficiency model. It would be more efficient to take the staff they've been able to get for that. So for example, we have about 100 for that site and allocate those to the existing hospitals. And if we get to a point past that 90% confidence level where we're in the risk factor of us surging more than what we think we're going to get, by that point in time, we hopefully will be able to staff some of these additional centers that are already set up with people from different states, which is what you're seeing a little bit now of in New York. So we're already in talks with some of our safety net partners in Texas, particularly because their surge is slated to be out past ours by a couple of weeks. So we would be able to borrow a surge of nurses and physicians, for example, for a 14-day period to help fill these mobile hospitals and then send them back out to Texas and maybe even be able to send some of our own. So that's the plan as it stands today throughout the state. South Florida, as you know, the 3 counties they're focused on are Palm Beach, Miami-Dade, and Broward, significantly because that's where the majority of our patients are. The deaths in Broward County and Palm Beach are increasing compared to the number in Miami-Dade, but a lot of that, has to do with how many patients are we testing, how fast are the results coming back. So I think there's a little bit of variable in there as well.
Thank you very much. As I mentioned earlier, I find the mobile hospital concept very, very important, and hopefully we won't need it, but it's good to know it'll be there. I'd like to now begin a very interesting presentation from OneBlood. As you all know, OneBlood is our blood center for the entire state as well as several other states, and we have three distinguished people going to discuss the subject of convalescent plasma. First is Dr. Richard Gammon. He is their medical director. He's board certified in clinical pathology as well as blood banking and transfusion medicine, and is on the faculty of several of our medical universities, including University of Central Florida, University of South Florida, and Nova. Dr. Rita Wright is their chief medical officer and is also certified in anatomic pathology, clinical pathology, blood banking, and transfusion medicine, and is a graduate of University of Miami, and is a national authority on blood banking and transfusion medicine and multiple transfusion medicine organizations. Thank you for coming and bringing us this new information.
All right. Thank you so much for inviting us to talk with you. This is an extremely important meeting to us because you represent the physicians of the state of Florida. And of course, it's no secret we're heading into a pretty significant crisis. And as you all are well aware, last week, FDA approved the use of convalescent plasma from COVID-19 recovered persons for treatment of disease. It has shown some very promising results, actually, in the studies out of China, some of which are not yet published. We do have a consultant working with us who is one of the authors on the Chinese studies, and she has sort of insider information. So and there have been good anecdotal information in the United States on the few units that have been transfused to patients. You may have become aware that the mayor of Miami, Francis Suarez, was the first convalescent COVID person to donate plasma for a person he did not know whose family pleaded for a donor, and he became aware of it, and he knew that he was eligible, so he donated. And this is anecdotal, of course, but much to our very pleasant surprise, the donor had a steady downhill course on the ventilator at age 71 in the hospital, showed significant improvement within 24 hours of receiving that product, and they were able to lower the ventilator setting. So this was very consistent with what our consultant from China said they had seen in their study of 100 of these types of patients. So we think we have something here that can help turn the tide or flatten the curve or whatever it's going to take to get ahead of this. Our problem, and this is what I'd like to focus my introductory remarks on, is that we have no inventory of this product. It's manufactured one by one from donors. And so we have a very somewhat burdensome front end to getting the donors through the door, because the FDA has put some guard bands around the screening requirements for these donors. So they have to be eligible as blood donors, and that's simple. We do eligible blood donors and collect plasma on them all the time. So that part of the process is a piece of cake for us. The problem is that the donors have to meet certain criteria based on how far out they are from their last symptom. They have to have a series of tests based on where they are out from their last symptom. There are considerations about female donors who've ever been pregnant in HLA. So there's a series of tests that have to be taken care of. And this is where we turn to our physician partners in the hospitals in our community to help us, because we have no database of COVID positive people. But many of you do know who they are and can reach out to them, or family members that have survived COVID and now have a family member in the hospital, et cetera, to see if they might be interested in donating. It's a new process. It's been manual so far. This weekend we brought up an automated front end for the actual donor that's interested in getting into the system. We hope to have the front end for the physicians who have perhaps a patient that they would like to treat and also a donor for that patient or another patient that they would like to put in the system. So we're in a transition period, and I'm going to apologize ahead of time for that because, as you can imagine, it's been a very crazy week. We have a lot of pent-up demand for this product, a lot of very emotionally engaged people that are trying to get it to their critically loved one or friend as quickly as possible. And we don't have anything on the shelf that we can hand off to them. So it's very challenging. It will smooth out, hopefully, unless, of course, we get, the system gets incredibly overwhelmed. And as Dr. Bush pointed out, we have some pretty grim predictions of numbers of cases coming at us in the next 2 weeks, which hopefully will not pan out. But if it does, it may not really smooth out too much. So I just wanted to reach out to you to gain your understanding and support as we move through this, and to really make it clear that, it isn't something we have control over, that the front end of it, the identification of the donor and the qualification of the donor has to meet FDA regulations for this experimental product. And we entirely are relying on the clinicians to do those tests and use, FDA-approved testing and do them within the proper timeframes for us to qualify that donor. So having said that, again, I want to thank you. This is a very historic moment, I think, for all of us. We're going to learn a lot. And I'd like to turn it over now to Dr. Gammon, who has the scientific piece of this to present.
Thank you, Dr. Reich. So we're going to break this into 3 parts. We're going to talk a little bit about the results of a study that was published in JAMA last week. And Dr. Reich is correct. There were a few other papers out there that weren't peer-reviewed, and I didn't feel comfortable sharing with the group. Hopefully there'll be more out there. Then we'll talk about the OneBlood process, and then I've got kind of a frequently asked questions section, and then we'll wrap it up and open it to the discussions. And we've got Martin Grable here from our administrative end that'll be available to answer questions as well. So the paper out of JAMA, I summarized it here in the next several slides. This was done at Shenzhen Hospital in China. The patients had to be diagnosed with quantitative reverse transcriptase PCR to be eligible to receive, and the CCP is the COVID-19 convalescent plasma, if they met the following criteria that you see on the screen. The patients had neutralizing antibody titers that were tested 1 day before receiving the convalescent plasma. The ABO blood types of the patients were identified to ensure compatibility. And these patients received antiviral agents until the COVID-19 viral loads became negative. And that means they received it during their entire course of hospital stay, those that received the plasma and those that didn't. And that's one, we'll talk about the limitations in a moment of this study. The donors were five donors, ages 18 to 60, and you can see the characteristics of the donors on the slide here. Let me turn on the laser pointer. Over here, the plasma was collected by apheresis. These individuals had been recovered from COVID-19 infection and tested negative. They were asymptomatic for 10 days. It's a little different than the criteria we're going to talk about in a moment for the U.S. The serum COVID-19 ELISA antibody titer had to be higher than 1 in 1,000. And if you look over here on the screen, you can see that the antibody titers were definitely higher than that, and the neutralizing antibody titer greater than 40. And again, all the donors had titers at least double that. Other patients, 5 patients, you can see the age ranges over here, and they're shown on this table from the JAMA article. They're all treated between 10 and 22 days after admission. One of the things I wanted to just kind of show you, because there's a lot on this screen here, but the complications, most of them, I guess all of them had ARDS, and all of them were classified as critical for disease classification. So this was, again, used selectively, at least in these patients, for those that were the most sickest. These patients received 2 treatments of 200 milliliters of plasma. and the unit was transfused the same day as the donation. And again, there'll be some differences between what we can do in the U.S. and what was done in China, and we'll talk about that in a moment. The results, so for the 5 patients, the body temperature is normalized within 3 days. You can see that very nicely on this graph here. One of them did not. A sequential organ failure assessment that they were using decreased in the patients. The data is not shown on the screen. You can see the PaO2 and the FiO2 increased within 12 days, and the viral load decreased and became negative within 12 days in several of the patients. And when they consider the normal range 0 to 7, you can see patient 1 and patient 4 met that criteria. Talking about their antibody titers here, the specific ELISA and neutralizing antibody titers increased after the transfusion of the plasma. You can see it on these 3 charts. ARDS resolved in 4 patients after 12 days. 3 patients were weaned from mechanical ventilation within 2 weeks. 3 were discharged within 2 months, and 2 were in stable condition at the end of the study period. So there are some significant limitations to this study, as you no doubt know. Small numbers, 5 is not necessarily a large amount, and there were no controls. It's unclear if the patients would have improved with or without the convalescent plasma. All patients were treated with multiple other agents during their entire course of stay until the viral load became negative. That includes antivirals and steroids. Also, mentioned that the convalescent plasma was given between 10 and 22 days after admission. So the authors raised the question, what if we gave this at a different time? Would that have had different outcomes on the patient? And also whether this approach reduced case fatality rates is also unknown. So the authors concluded that the study highlighted the possibility that antibodies from convalescent plasma may have contributed to clearance of the virus and improvement of symptoms. All right, so let's change gears and talk a little bit about what's going on right now in the U.S. and more specifically with OneBlood. So as far as patients go, the FDA does approve use of the infusion of COVID-19 convalescent plasma on an individual patient basis with an emergency IND. And I'll show you, we have some links available to that. That can be done either through a written request that can be approved in a few hours, or an emergency phone call if the patient is very sick, and that can be done. A verbal can be given over the phone, followed by written approval. You know, it's really up to the hospitals and physicians to define the patients to treat. I showed you some criteria in that study, but that's by no means standardized. And the dosage isn't standardized. You know, a non-peer reviewed journal I looked at just gave 1 dose of plasma. So we don't know at this point if 1, 2, or even more would be an appropriate dosage. While the literature shows the transfusion happened on the day of collection, the FDA has gave us clear guidelines. Dr. Reich has been in communication with Dr. Peter Marks, who's the head of Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, or CBER, that oversees the blood banks in the U.S. And he was clear that he wants the infectious disease testing done on these units before they go out to the individual patients. So even though we're working closely with our testing facility, Creative Testing Solutions, to get this turned around pretty quickly, it may not be the same day that we send out the plasma product. This is just pathways to treat patients. You know, the clinical trials and the expanded access are there for individuals that are doing research. For this group, most likely you're going to be using single patient emergency IND that we just talked about on the last slide. This is a physician letter, and this material was, you should have a copy of this right out to the group, and there is a link on the PDF file to view the FDA guidance, and there is some information for you to call. It's basically a COVID hotline if you've got a patient that meets your needs. And as Dr. Wright mentioned, we are up, this is a work in progress. We hope to have a site up for the physicians sometime this week. What do we need from the physicians? We need documentation of SARS-CoV infection and the donors that we're bringing in. We need documentation that these individuals actually have had a laboratory test with a diagnosis. So if a doctor tells them, look, those symptoms, may be consistent with COVID, self-quarantine for 14 days. If they don't have a test, they're not going to be able to qualify as a donor. Also, if they present 14 to 27 days after becoming symptom-free, then OneBlood's going to need negative results for COVID-19, either from one or more nasopharyngeal swab specimens or by a molecular diagnostic test from blood. If the donors present symptom-free, 28 days or longer, then they're eligible, and per the FDA, we do not need additional documentation of a prior, we require diagnosis of the initial COVID test, but we do not need a confirmatory negative test to confirm recovery. So just to kind of walk through that briefly again, we're generally not going to accept individuals that are less than 14 days out. 14 to 27 days, we'll need the initial test and an additional test to show that they now are free of the COVID-19. If they come 28 days or more out after they've been symptom-free, then all we need is the initial test. No additional testing needs to be done. As far as the donors go, Dr. Reich alluded to this in her discussion. OneBlood will take the lead. If it's a female who's been has a history of pregnancy, we will need to test for HLA antibodies because these folks they're going to be receiving the units, most likely on ventilators, and we don't want to put them at risk for additional transfusion-related acute lung injury that could cause their condition to deteriorate. The donors will need to meet all allogeneic blood donor eligibility criteria on the day of donation. The current guidelines by the FDA say that the donors may donate plasma once every 28 days. The OneBlood medical directors can make exceptions on frequency on a case-by-case basis. So, again, that'll be something we'll be looking at as we go forward. If we have issues with the donor pool, that is something that we could be looking at if we need to get more donors in or more donations available. There will be a pre-screening health history questionnaire, and this will be completed by 3 individuals. It'll be completed by the patients. The healthcare provider will have to complete a section that you see on the screen, and it's also been should be available as part of the materials for this lecture today. And then OneBlood personnel will finish the screening of the donor, and that will be signed off by a blood bank medical director. And there's a paper form, and the physician needs to put an attestation that's listed on the screen as well for the testing. The products that may be collected, if we collect it by apheresis, we hope to get 1 to up to even 3 units of plasma that's collected. And just a point of clarification, because I've gotten some questions from this on docs. The emergency IND needs to be for each individual patient that's going to be receiving the product. The blood collection can be from one donor, and multiple products can be collected, and that can go to multiple patients. So what the FDA has told us is this is a standard blood product, just like the plasma that you would normally keep in the hospital. The difference is that this is from individuals that have recovered from COVID. So from our end, if an individual, for example, collects a plasma on apheresis and 3 components are being able to be made, then that can go to the hospital and potentially go to 3 different patients. But each of the patients will need their own EIND. And if it's collected from whole blood, then we'll only get 1 unit. And as Dr. Reich alluded to, our very first Florida donor was the mayor of Miami. Donor letter. So we do have a donor letter that's part of our toolkit. And if you have a donor that is interested, you can give them a copy of the letter, again, included with the packet. It tells them where to call. One of the nice things, and like I said, we're going to try to be getting it up for the physicians, but we have it now for the donors, at least online, is they can actually go right to our website. They can say they want to donate convalescent plasma, and then they answer a series of questions. Here, Are they willing to donate? Do they want to have information shared? They fill out their information. Are they symptomatic? Has it been at least 14 days? Date of the last symptom. There's a nice calendar here. And have you had the follow-up test? And, then they answer this and they submit it. And the donors, if you have an individual that's interested in donating for one of your patients, they can certainly mention that when they're talking to our OneBlood personnel, that they're interested in doing a directed donation to someone from someone at a particular hospital. So we're hoping to get, as Dr. Reich alluded to, we're hoping to get doctors from you, donors from your patients, and also donors from the community. Let me go on. So last section, frequently asked questions. So what is CCP? Well, it provides a passive immunity to antibody therapy. And there is a track record of it using it basically back to the Spanish influenza outbreak. And, Dr. Bush spoke about this as well. Before we had antibiotics, this was much more, these plasma and the immune globulins were much more used than antivirals and antibiotics today. And it was used during outbreaks of other respiratory illness pandemics. And you can see some nice pictures from the Spanish flu on the right side. I've got the reference down there if anyone wants to look at further old pictures. Will it help the treatment of COVID patients? It appears that way. Further investigation is still necessary. And, eventually we hope to be able to get the pharmaceutical companies to produce an immune globulin. But that's still several months away. And, this is a nice bridge that can be done now at this point by both OneBlood and other blood centers throughout the U.S. What does the antibody titer require? So, a few comments on that. The FDA, the antibody testing is not ready to be done on these products in real time. So we're going to collect the product, we'll do the infectious disease testing, and send it off to your patient. A sample at this point will go to the National Institutes of Health for testing, but that will not be available until after the transfusion. We're looking at possibly setting up testing at OneBlood, and you can see the recommended titer is what you see on the screen, greater than 1 and 180, 1 to 80. And that concludes the presentation. Be happy to open up any questions. I think we have a question already, if I'm looking on the screen.
Dr. Vernon has a question. Stephen Vernon.
Yes. So my question, Rich, is in order to expedite things, since you know who your donor is going to be, why don't you draw the donor's infectious disease testing 1 day or 2 days before the plasma is collected? It's a little out of ordinary, but it seems like you could do that.
Sure, and I'll make an attempt to answer that. And we've got Dr. Reich here, who's basically the project lead. I mean, it's more of a logistic issue at this point. I think as we wrap up, certainly that does make sense. But we've got then the individual has to make 2 separate trips. And the way we're collecting these right now is these individuals are not going into branches. We're bringing them out to different mobiles, sites. We're bringing a mobile to them, and then they're going to be able to be collected there. So we're trying to minimize exposure to our staff. I'll stop there and turn it over to Dr. Reich and see if you want to add some additional comments. I don't want to misspeak on this.
The FDA generally wants the physical exam and testing done on the day of donation. Not to say that, the medical director might be able to wiggle around that a little bit, but I think in general, for the massive amount of donors we're anticipating, making a blanket exception probably would not necessarily be something that the medical director would feel comfortable doing. We would have to get FDA approval to do it at any kind of volume that I am anticipating we'll have. I guess as long as I have the microphone, there are a couple comments I'd like to make too that I failed to in the beginning. 28 days has been shown in the Chinese studies to be the day when they have the highest titer. So even though it may be tempting to take somebody 3 months out, et cetera, ideally, you're really walking a very fine line there where you don't want to have them shedding virus, but you also still want a nice high antibody titer. So 28 days has really been shown in the somewhat limited studies we have to be the optimum time. And the other thing I want to point out, because it came up as a point of confusion already, is that although we think of type O as being a universal donor, it is not the universal donor on the plasma side. So you can give type O to people on the red cell side as a universal donor, but the universal plasma donor is actually type AB. So when you're looking at your donors and your patient match and you think you have a donor, just, please keep that in mind that if, you have an AB patient, you're going to have to get only an AB plasma, basically, to be sure that you have compatibility.
Dr. Cosgrove has a question.
What is the average time of the first infusion of the plasma to most patients?
Well, I can speak to our experience at OneBlood only, and it's an experience of 1 unit so far. It took us 4 days of a full-time team manually to get that whole front end together and get it infused into the patient. That included waiting for infectious disease testing. That happened to be a frequent blood donor, so we had a high, expectation that they would pass their infectious disease test. But that is something to bear in mind, is that even at best right now, it's not like calling for a unit of blood from the blood center. We pull it off the shelf and put it in a box and send it to you. We have to round up a donor and put them through, a multi-step process to qualify them before we can even collect. We do have mobile buses that we've dedicated to this, and we are willing to go just about anywhere to collect a donor. So once we have a donor cleared, the only thing that stops us is the infectious disease testing. We have to draw it and then wait for it for the next day. And then, we still have the hopefully remote possibility by that time that they might not pass their infectious disease test. But it is not.
I have a quick question. How do we get the word out that this program is available?
Well, I think we have sent to you, the Florida Medical Association, what we're calling our toolkit. And I don't know how you can distribute that widely, whether it's via email might be the best way to your membership. But, that would probably be the best way to get the word out to the community at large that although not widely available yet, we're certainly ramping up and trying to get started. And we would love to have, donors that are not directed so that we could actually get a frozen inventory on the shelf to pull out, quickly if we needed to.
Do you have a plan to market this directly to the public to get donors? Non-directed donors? Okay.
Yes, we have actually gone, thanks to, Mayor Suarez, we've been on national television. We've been on local television. We have it on our website. We have it on our social media page. We've done everything we can to bang the drum to get, the public interested in donating. And they can go right to our website at oneblood.org and actually log themselves in, answer all the questions, and kind of do their own pre-screen to see if they're eligible. I guess I should also mention that you may have seen or heard there was a press release and a press conference that touched on it. The federal government has put together a clearinghouse, a national clearinghouse for donors to on a website where they can log in anywhere in the United States, screen themselves and put in their zip code, and then the clearinghouse will then send them to the nearest blood center where they are located. So we expect to get quite a few people that way once it becomes widely known and is fully running.
Dr. Riggs has a question.
Oh, thanks. What do we do up here in North Florida? Is Life South participating? And secondly, are the EIND reporting requirements to FDA and IRB suspended for this, or are they still in play like for all the other EINDs?
My understanding of, I'll answer your last question first. My understanding of the EIND is that the samples we send to NIH from the donors that we draw are approved under a national IRB for them to use for studies, going beyond just doing the antibody titers, and they also can use them for a biorepository. The EIND is not under IRB, although at OneBlood we have decided to go ahead and put the EIND portion of it under our IRBs for approval, so that indeed, if other studies wanted to be done, locally, we could get samples and have a biorepository and basically report out our findings. So at this point, Rich can probably touch on that because he heads up our research department, and I believe he has put the paperwork in for the IRB approval for the EIND aspect of it at OneBlood, and then there is like some national studies headed up by Johns Hopkins and others that are closed as far as I know, except to certain institutions, and that's another route for doing studies. So stay tuned. I think that the local blood centers will probably start doing their own studies and reporting their own experiences in their communities, which would be a wonderful thing to see. I don't know where Life South is exactly with this right now. I'm sure they're ramping up like everybody else, though.
Dr. Petit has a question.
There was recently a report out of California about IgG being isolated against this COVID-19 virus. And they got this off to the Army to replicate it. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, as Rich mentioned, we talk almost daily to the head of CBER, and I can tell you that they're very excited and pushing very hard to get a pharmaceutical, concentrated IgG product out to this population. On the other hand, I must say that hearing the anecdotes, I am a little bit more of a wild card, I guess. I wonder if there might be something more than just the antibodies at play to get such fast results in such, very sick patients. And maybe there's a secret sauce in there we might lose if we purify it too much. But, we will know very soon, I think, because that antibody development is on a fast track. And we will soon see how effective it is.
Dr. Vasquez?
Yeah, my question is pertaining community hospitals. I work in a small community hospital, and my question is pertaining whether the blood bank personnel in the community hospitals are sufficiently educated and prepared to dispense this type of product. Are there any regulatory requirements for the hospital laboratory to comply with, and if their administration of the product differs in some way to what is employed in routine plasma product administration?
Yeah, because I've been dealing with this with several of the hospitals in the last week or so. So there's two ends of it that need to come into place. If you're going to have this in your hospital, there has to be a way, one, for your blood bank to receive it. So they've got to have certain codes to receive it. And your technologists, if they have questions about that, they can reach out to myself. We'll get you set up with the correct doctor in the region to handle it. The second item is your physicians need a way to order it. So if they order electronically, that'll need to be built into your IT system. If they order on paper, you'll have to have some way that the physicians can order it. But those are really the main two items that come into play. Your hospital can make decisions on, who gets it, dosing, but that's all more tailored to the individual hospital. It is an investigational product, so it's really up to the individual that's ordering it, what kind of dosing they want to give. But those two logistics, blood bank codes to receive it, and then the codes, how to order it in the hospital. If you get those together, you'll be all set.
Thank you.
Dr. Lenchis has a question.
So my question was, first, thank you very much for the presentation. I'd love to be able to get the copy of the slides that you presented. But with respect to the fact that COVID-19 is a reportable event to the Department of Health, has there been any thought to working with the department and trying to identify those patients that have recovered and then go after them in a more targeted fashion? And the second part of my question was, I noticed on the slide with the 5 patients that were treated in China, all those 5 were given Kaletra, which we're not doing here in the States. It'd be interesting to see what the use of hydroxychloroquine and azithro is in patients that got convalescent plasma. And I wonder if we have any results from the state of New York, if they're doing this yet.
So I can answer the first question about the Florida Department of Health. They actually were the first place we went to try to get a donor database to see if we could identify people who are COVID positive. And, to their credit, they actually were very sensitive about protecting the patient's privacy. And so it was actually their suggestion that we work through the Florida Medical Association to contact the patients and identify them. And Rich, I don't know if you want to tackle the second question.
I'm not, unfortunately, I'm not familiar with, what New York State is doing at this point in time. Again, Dr. Wright mentioned we do have daily communication with the FDA and with the national blood organizations, but I don't have an answer for the second part. I will say, though, about the slides and the materials that we presented, we did give all those materials. I gave all those materials to the Food and Drug Administration, too many acronyms, to the Florida Medical Associations. I would ask that Dr. Giffler, Matt, and Melissa feel free to share the PowerPoint slides and the 3 types of letters that I emailed to you last night. We certainly want to make sure everyone has copies of those.
And that will be available on our website. We have one more question on this topic from Dr. Vernon, and then I'd like to switch to have some discussion regarding the regulatory efforts and legislative efforts to affect the financial impact of this epidemic on our doctors' practices. So, Dr. Vernon?
Thanks, Ron. To Rich and Rita, I just want to let you know that this subject has already been under discussion at the executive committee level of the Florida Society of Pathologists, since the blood banks throughout the state are largely or almost entirely directed by the pathologists. Certainly they need this information, and we are going to use all the material that we have available to get it out to them. But, and my question to both of you is, you've sort of answered it, I think, but will you be cooperating with other blood centers where there might be many more convalescent patients? I think in Florida, there's been a lot of tests and there's a lot of positive tests, but we may not have convalescent patients coming out of the woodwork. I think there's going to be a lot more in some other geographical areas. So will you be cooperating with them, number one, to get material, treating material, and number two, relative to communication and so forth?
Well, I do believe that the clearinghouse is going to be the mechanism that the federal government counts on to ensure collaboration. It involves not just the independent blood centers that are part of America's blood centers, but also the American Red Cross. So you've got us all rolled up into one big database, and you have, you have it organized so that it identifies donors, screens donors, and then sends them right back to their local blood center for collection. And the blood centers have always had a history of collaboration in every crisis. So you can count on the fact that as soon as we have inventory on the shelf, and we will be sharing it with each other as needed.
And just to add to Dr. Wright's comment, these are licensed blood products, so they can be shipped across state lines. And yes, I mean, I'm actually working with a case right now where we may have a couple donors in Pennsylvania where the plasma is collected and then shipped down to the OneBlood service area. So some of it's going to depend on the supply. We've got everyone's kind of ramping up their donations right now. And once we have more donations to handle than our service area needs, then, certainly there would be that opportunity for cooperation.
Thank you very much. That was very informative, and we will all have to work hard to get the message out. And Dr. Goldman indicated via text that the American College of Physicians in Florida can help get this message out as well. I want to switch now to regulatory and financial resources updates because of the critical negative impact this is having on so many of our practices around the state. So why don't we start with Jeff Scott and let us know what's new and how, if any, the governor's latest executive order Wednesday affects any of the previous ones.
Thank you, Dr. Giffler. I want to give you a brief update on the legal and regulatory developments since last Sunday. I'm going to start with the letter to Commissioner Altmaier. As I informed you last week, we sent him a letter asking for some action from the Department of Insurance on telehealth. Specifically, we asked him to allow all contracted physicians to provide telehealth services to their insured patients, regardless of whether it was COVID-19 related or not. We asked that they be able to use non-public facing remote communications consistent with then existing CMS policy. And we asked to ensure that the payment rates for telehealth were consistent with in-person visits, as well as information about how to bill for that. As of Tuesday, we had not received any response from Commissioner Altmaier. Despite talking to his legislative affairs director the previous week. Accordingly, Chris Clark contacted the state CFO, Jimmy Pertonis, to enlist his help in trying to urge Commissioner Altmaier to respond to our request. I think it was a good call that Chris had. The CFO agreed to do so. However, we have yet to still receive any response from the commissioner on our request. So given this lack of non-response and based on new CMS policy, specifically the authorization for coverage of telemedicine through audio-only means, the FMA prepared and sent another letter to Commissioner Altmaier urgently requesting him to order all health insurers in the state of Florida to provide telehealth coverage for their patients on a par similar to what CMS has done through the Medicare program. I know we've had a follow-up on a meeting between Senator Scott's office and Dr. Norris and Dr. Haishi. In that conversation, the senator had his staff follow up with Dr. Haishi. We've contacted our federal lobbyist, Erica Long, and asked her to follow up with Senator Scott's office to see if he would be willing to talk to the CFO Petronas. They have a good relationship, and the hope is that he'll be able, through that relationship, to move the CFO and the commissioner to take some action on this. We have yet to have any resolution. We will readdress this issue on Monday and see if there's any additional steps that we can take. On the liability protection front, we, as you know, we sent a letter to the governor asking for increased liability protections due to the imposition of his executive order 20-72. We had word that the letter was well received, and we were hopeful that there was going to be something out on Friday. The word we got back from the governor's office on a conversation that William Large had late Friday evening was that the stay-at-home order, which I'll talk about in a second, the questions and the implementation of that was a little more involved than what they expected. They got a little bit backed up on their orders, and that we're hopeful that there will be an order forthcoming by the middle of this next week. That's the hope. Again, I think if we don't hear back, we will reach out to the governor's office again on Tuesday. As I understand now, we have a phone conversation set with the governor for today. We can bring it up there, and hopefully we can press the point that liability protections are desperately needed, along with some other issues. So we will bring it up again today. We'll follow up, and hopefully we'll see something on the liability front by next week. We've also prepared an analysis of federal liability protections that are provided via the CARES Act, as well as that contained in a declaration that the HA Secretary issued on March 19th. So those are some additional federal protections. They're not particularly strong protections, but they're there. They're on our website. And if anybody has any questions about those, contact me after this call. I'll be glad to fill you in. On the if we're going to get something on the liability protection front from the governor, it looks like that we're also going to get something that we don't want on scope of practice. There's been a document that's been circulating through the department that would allow APRNs and PAs to practice independently immediately. And that is something that obviously we've opposed primarily from the PA standpoint. I know Dr. Gifler had a conversation with the Surgeon General expressing our reservations about such a program. We provided our position in an email to the department staff and let them know that we didn't think that that would be appropriate. But regardless, that may be something that's forthcoming here in the next week as well. The governor also issued Executive Order 20-91, the Safer at Home order that came out on Wednesday, I believe. It mandates two specific things: that senior citizens and individuals with a significant underlying medical condition are to stay home and to take all measures to limit their risk of exposure to COVID-19. And second, that all persons in Florida are to limit their movements and personal interactions outside of the home to only those necessary to obtain essential services or essential activities. The list of essential services are numerous. There's probably more things on there than things that are prohibited. And going over those, it's clear that physician services and practices are considered essential services and thus can continue to provide services to their patients as they've done before. Executive Order 20-72, the prohibition on elective surgery, however, is still in effect. So if you are open and you can stay open under 20-91, you still have to adhere to 20-72. And that's our understanding of that. If we hear differently in our call today or in any pronouncements forthcoming from the governors, we'll certainly let everybody know. The essential activities under 20-91 encompass attending religious services, participating in recreational activities, particularly fishing, taking care of pets, and caring for or otherwise assisting a loved one. Social gathering in a public space is not an essential activity, and is thus gatherings of more than 10 people are still prohibited. This order went into effect on 12/01 Friday morning, and it will remain in effect throughout the duration of the state of emergency. So those are the highlights that have occurred since last Sunday, and if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Question by Dr. Sion. All these telehealth apps versus simpler method of just talking on the phone, particularly for elderly patients who are not IT savvy. Jared, are you going to talk about telehealth billing issues?
I wasn't going to get into that in great detail, but if the question is related to the use of telehealth for audio only calls, is that how I am to?
I think that's what it boils down to. Yeah.
Yes, sir. So CMS did announce that it would pay for certain services on an audio-only basis, but these are specific E&M codes that are designed for telephonic or audio-only use. They are 99441 through 99443. We have an article that we put out on our website explaining them. Their valuation varies from 0.25 to 0.75 RVUs. Their worth that comes out to, it's going to depend on geography, but the analyses we've seen suggest between $14 and $42 per code. Again, there's more information on that on our website and a link to the guide on how to code for those services that has been presented by the AMA. That is a step-by-step kind of thing. And however, other telehealth services other than those that have these specific telephonic codes continue to require two-way communication, audio and video. Although, as you're probably also aware, Skype and FaceTime are currently permissible under the waiver that has been provided, or the discretion that has been provided under HIPAA. So, there are some specific E&M codes, telephonic E&M codes that are now reimbursable on an audio-only basis through Medicare, traditional Medicare. And again, we have an article on that outlines those codes, outlines evaluation and with respect to RVUs and practice expense inputs, and provides links to coding guidance. Obviously, it would be nice if CMS would waive the requirements for regular E&M codes, which reimburse more, so that physicians would have wider access to telephone-only telehealth services. But as of this time, as of the interim rule that CMS most recently published, they are only providing payment for the specific telephone audio-only codes.
Okay. Could you go back, Jared, and then go over the financial resources update? I know the various several loan plans, including the payroll protection plan, which is probably the largest one for doctors, rolled out late this week, a few days ago. And could you explain that and what resources are available to us? I know some of them are on our own website. Could you go into that for us?
Yes, sir. Let me just go ahead and start by thanking you for recognizing me and thanking the members of the board. I'll give an overview of some of the financial programs and resources related to COVID-19 that are available to physicians. There are two particular provisions of the CARES Act that I want to focus on, which is the $349 billion Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP, that is being administered by the Small Business Administration, that is SBA, and the $100 billion healthcare fund that will be administered by HHS. I want to preface my remarks by stating that the CARES Act was signed into law just over a week ago on March 27th. So suffice to say, this is all brand new. As you're all aware, this was a $2.2 trillion financial relief package. And, to use a term that's been used a lot today, it is just unprecedented in many different ways. I say this because, given the rapid pace at which this law is being implemented, and new information is literally constantly becoming available. We sent out information just this past Friday that many of you probably received related to the payroll protection program. And therefore, it's important that if this is something that, something that you're monitoring, that you regularly check for updates. We, of course, will be providing information as quickly as we get it. Realize that, new guidance is still going to be issued. Some guidance on some topics related to the CARES Act is yet to be issued. And, also these programs that I'm going to mention, obviously there's more depth to them than we can cover in in the course of a phone call. So I'm not going to attempt to give a comprehensive overview. But if you go to our website, we do have links to the guidance from the SBA and from other entities that explains everything at a greater level of granularity. And of course, I can answer any questions that are answered in the guidance that's been released thus far. And of course, certainly, if you decide to go forward with utilizing any of these programs, you may want to contact the SBA with respect or a SBA qualified lender, or of course your accountant or financial advisor, or whoever it is you rely on for advice or information. Again, new information and new guidance is going to be issued, probably very soon, possibly even today. Wouldn't totally shock me. I wouldn't want to have to, bet my life that something won't drop, between now and the end of our phone call. So anyways, of course, feel free to contact us with any questions you might have so that we can give you any information that is currently available. So let's start with the Payroll Protection Act, or PPP, which as of this past is now accepting applications. This program authorizes up to $349 billion in forgivable loans to small businesses to pay their employees during the COVID-19 epidemic. And so most small businesses, including 501c3 not-for-profits, veterans organizations, sole proprietorships, and physician practices, of course, hospitals, self-employed individuals, and independent contractors with 500 or fewer employees can apply for this program. The amount of the loan is capped at 2.5 times monthly payroll and up to $10 million. And eligible payroll costs are capped at $100,000 on an annualized basis per employee. The amount of the loan will be forgiven if the loan proceeds are used to cover eligible expenses, payroll costs, and certain other non-payroll expenses over the course of an 8-week period. And employee and compensation levels are maintained subject to the terms provided under the Act. In addition to that, the Treasury Department has issued guidance that stipulates that no more than 25% of the forgiven amount may be used for non-payroll cost. In other words, they expect that 75% of the amount will be used to cover payroll costs, and that not greater than 25% will be used to cover rent and utilities and other eligible expenses. So, also take that into consideration when evaluating the applications and other information regarding to the loans. That is in the and this information and all this other information and an even greater level of granularity, I should say, is available in an information sheet that the Treasury Department has published, and which is published on the Treasury Department's website, which we link to on our website, and we provide an overview of this information as well as a link to the interim final rule as well. And so there's some other terms we can get into, but really the important thing to know is this: most qualifying businesses were eligible to begin applying for this as of last Friday. Or 2 days ago. So you can apply directly through any approved lender, and this would include any number of large banks. And the SBA on their website has a full list of all the lenders that are eligible. Certainly, there are a couple things here that I need to note. And first and foremost, the money under this program is limited, and I really can't emphasize that enough. If you are interested in applying for this program, you need to do so soon. You need $349 billion sounds like a lot of money. And in ordinary times, I think it would be considered a lot of money under just about any law that Congress might enact. However, it's important to keep in mind that according to the Chamber of Commerce, there are 30.2 million small businesses in the U.S., including around 21 million or so sole proprietorships. According to Senator Rubio on Twitter, as of 6 p.m. on Friday, 13,700 small businesses had already applied for loans valued at more than 4.3 billion U.S. Presupposing that information is accurate, I have no reason to believe it's inaccurate. That's about $314,000 per loan on average. Now, 349 billion divided by 314,000 is a little more than 1.1 million businesses, or about 3.64% of the total. So even if we generously assume that the average value of those loans will drop in half over time as relatively smaller businesses apply later relatively later than larger businesses that are eligible, that still would only amount for enough funds for 7.28% of the estimated 30.2 million small businesses in existence. Obviously, we don't know how many businesses will ultimately want to apply, or what the ultimate average amount of those loans will be. But this is all very back of the envelope, but you get the idea. That money is probably going to go pretty quick. So if you're interested at all, contact your lender, visit the SBA's website, contact your financial advisor if you have one, or accountant if you have one, and look into the details of this right away. Again, another thing, so the law was enacted last Friday. The Treasury Department issued guidance this Friday. The rollout of this program so far has been rocky, to say the least. A lot of lenders feel the guidance that the Treasury Department has issued has been unclear. That guidance that has been published may be subject to change or revision or clarification. And therefore, it really is important, to note that, you should check on the SBA's website and check with your approved lender to make sure that you're getting the most up-to-date information. This is, again, to use the overused term, this is unprecedented. The SBA has never had $349 billion, and that they've tried to get out the door now in just a week. We can expect that this is going to be rocky. It actually shocks me the program managed to roll out as quickly as it did when you think about it, given that the financial capital of our nation is also the epicenter for a global pandemic. The fact that, a lot of these banks are issuing these loans already is, fairly impressive when you think about it on those terms. The other thing as well is that, the law, also provides $100 billion in financial support for hospitals, physicians, and other healthcare providers to cover reimbursable expenses related to COVID-19. And this money is basically designed to cover, anything that is not, going to be paid for already or by an insurance company, or obligated to be paid for already by some other, entity like an insurance company. In other words, this is $100 billion in funds for hospitals and physician offices and other types of providers to cover things like increased staff for training, personal protective equipment, and most importantly, perhaps foregone revenue from canceled procedures and so forth. The $100 billion fund is supposed to be made available as quickly as possible, and there's some things in the law that help facilitate that theoretically. But HHS, has been given significant flexibility to determine how those funds will be allocated. The Secretary is expected to release guidance on the application process shortly. We're monitoring the situation very closely. $100 billion sounds like a lot of money, but our healthcare system in 2018 spent about $3.65 trillion, including, and to give you a slightly more granularity there, that would include somewhere in the vicinity of 1.2 trillion or so for hospitals, and about 750 billion for physicians, based again on 2018 data. So given the size of our healthcare system, $100 billion, which is a lot of money, may go relatively quickly. Anyways, we've heard some rumors that are at this point are unsubstantiated that unfortunately the Secretary may try to make this money available primarily or even exclusively for hospitals. And while hospitals certainly deserve money and certainly need money, we also want to make sure that physician practices have an opportunity to get some of that as well. So that has been a huge, from the standpoint of advocacy, that's been a huge issue for us. We co-signed a letter with the AMA this past Friday to urge the Secretary to make a portion of the funds available for physicians, and gave him some information to, that will hopefully encourage him to do so. According to an article that was recently published in Modern Healthcare, physician offices shed $12,000 in March alone, and I don't have any doubt that that number probably underestimates the true total, and certainly no doubt that that number has grown. So again, we're lobbying the Secretary Azar very hard to set aside some of that $100 billion for physician practices. Although again, there's no official guidance available at this time, so we can't ultimately tell you how that $100 billion is going to be spent.
Let me offer my own little personal experience. There's the form to apply for the payroll protection plan is very simple for the practice to fill out. However, before the loan can be processed, the bank, they have their forms also to submit to Small Business Administration. And that's where there's a big glitch right now, because their forms are a bit more complex and they're not entirely clear on how to go about completing the process from their end. So I would still get your forms filled out as soon as possible. I had mine submitted Friday. Friday was the day they first came out, and my application was done and submitted to my bank immediately, and they're not quite sure how to complete their end of it. But don't waste a minute. Dr. Howard had a question about who are the approved lenders, and I want to say Jarrett referred to the website that lists the lenders, but that's not necessarily a complete list. If you have a bank you work with, call them up and ask them if they're an approved SBA lender, and they may not be in the list, but they may tell you, yes, definitely. Chad, you want to tell us, or is that old news already, about the Medicare Advanced Payment Plan?
Yeah, certainly. Let me touch on that as well. So Medicare has also announced with respect to Medicare Part B that they will be making or authorizing advance payments. This was something that was authorized under the CARES Act. Essentially, the idea is that Medicare will, allow you to request an amount of money up to 3 months of Medicare payments. The easiest way to think about this is essentially a 7-month loan where Medicare will front you up to 3 months of Medicare payments. And essentially for 4 months, that is for 120 days, you don't have to repay anything. And then within 210 days, the money has to be repaid. And, to qualify for this, the qualifications are pretty straightforward. You have to have billed Medicare within the past 180 days. Not be in bankruptcy, not be under active medical review or program integrity investigation by CMS, and not have any outstanding delinquent Medicare overpayments. The amount of payment, again, is up to 3 months Medicare payments, and this is essentially the guidance that CMS put out did not define what 3 months payment is. I have spoken to Noridian, which is one of the Medicare administrative contractors, and they told me that basically the way, if you just request the maximum amount on the form that you can get through First Coast Service Options website, that they're going to use your historic data and take a 3-month average based on some, specific months in the past year. But the bottom line is that's basically kind of the amount that you can roughly anticipate. You can enter an amount, a lesser amount as well, obviously. And, the bottom line is when you're applying for this, I feel the guidance is a little bit vague, but the good news is that it's pretty easy to get information. First Coast Service Options, our Medicare administrative contractor, has their lines open 5 days a week, and they're easy enough to get a hold of and answer questions as you submit the form. This is, again, though, money, it's going to have to be paid back. Eventually, this is not a grant. There's no indication that this money is going to be forgiven. And after the first 120 days through, the repayment period, CMS is going to automatically start the recoupment process by offsetting the payment that you receive on any new claims to pay the advance loan. So instead of receiving payment for newly submitted claims after 120 days, the physician's outstanding balance would be reduced by the claim payment amount owed to them. And this process is automatic. And again, the amount is to be repaid in full with 210 days. But the bottom line is it could shore up cash flows. It's definitely positive. There's nothing bad about the legislation. Just keep in mind, or about the program rather, just keep in mind that, this is not, forgivable money, or CMS has provided no indication of that. Be aware, if you look into it again, contact First Coast Service Options or visit their website for more information. We also have links and an explainer on our page and links to the Medicare, or rather CMS FAQ guide that was released along with the program that goes into all the details. One other thing I'll mention too is that for MIPS for 2019, there is some reporting relief. Essentially, if you don't want to report data to CMS for the 2019 MIPS program year, you don't have to. You can apply for an extreme and uncontrollable circumstances application between now and April 30th. And that basically, if you do this and you don't submit data, then you would get a neutral adjustment in 2021 based on your, and again, I want to emphasize this, for your 2019 MIPS program year for, the data that is supposed to be submitted soon under that program. And essentially, so that means you wouldn't be penalized if you were going to be penalized for having a score that is below the performance threshold. CMS also on their website, they have a tool that you can use to see if the policy has been applied to you automatically. For some people, it will be applied automatically, and otherwise you can submit an application and say that in the event that you've already submitted some data, you can submit an application for the extreme and uncontrollable circumstances policy. And again, we'll have some more information on that on our webpage. But the bottom line is, for the 2019 program year, MIPS, there's going to be some reporting relief, right? It remains to be seen if CMS will provide a reporting relief for the 2020 MIPS program year, which is probably, more on your minds than the 2019 program year at this point. And CMS has said, they haven't said anything regarding that yet, but it's up that they are evaluating their options for doing so. So stay tuned, I guess. I want to end just with, a data point. According to Google, searches for the word unprecedented recently hit an all-time high. Searches for the word unprecedented previously hit their apex shortly after the 2016 elections, and the number of searches for that word have roughly doubled, during this time period relative to what they were back then. So the unprecedented number of searches for the word unprecedented really helps just underscore how unprecedented all of this is, and why you should continue to be on the lookout for new information, and be aware that new information and guidance is likely going to flow in daily. This is all a wild ride, so please stay tuned for updates, and of course we'll be doing everything we can to post new information to our website to keep doctors informed and do anything that we can to help financially, or help physicians get financial relief. We understand how precarious this time is. And with that, I'll close. I thank you for all you do, and thank you for giving me that.
Jared, Dr. Murphy has a question.
Hey, Jared. Thanks for the presentation. I appreciate it. I'm part of a large group that you're probably aware of. We have many more than 500 employees. What options are out there right now for large groups greater than 500 employees?
So that's a great question. One of the options, of course, is theoretically through this $100 billion fund that HHS has created, but they have not issued any guidance on that. That fund, again, has no specific limitation with respect to practice size or anything else. However, that is still something that is forthcoming. The Medicare advance payments that I mentioned don't provide any restrictions with respect to practice size either. And the MIPS, reporting relief, I should clarify, is also not something that is, a function of practice size. That reporting relief, should your practice choose to avail yourselves of it, is something which is, available as well. So those are three potential options that come to mind offhand that may be beneficial. Also, keep in mind that CMS has expanded the availability of coverage for telehealth recently, and we can get into that separately if you'd like. But that may make it a little bit easier to bill, with respect to evaluation and management services for some of your patients. Another thing I didn't get to, but that I just want to mention is that, this $100 billion and this $350 billion for small businesses, in any event, that's probably inadequate, right? We know that, Congress is also already kind of talking about a phase 4 package that could potentially provide substantially more relief. Obviously, the details of that are unknown at this time because there is no phase 4 package yet, but something that we're pushing for strongly, and I know that all of organized medicine is for additional financial relief for healthcare providers in that package. There may be some other options as well that aren't coming to my mind offhand, but that is what comes to me.
Well, thank you very much. I hope you all got something out of this, and we really want to get feedback on this. I know there were some questions about the time. Remember, we had to coordinate a number of different speakers, and when that happens, we don't have a whole lot of flexibility in when we can put this together. But I will have these meetings continue as long as we have new information that we feel is worth getting out. And I think the cooperation and the interaction between all the virtual attendees, as you can tell, is gradually increasing. And so I think we're heading in the right direction there too. And Dr. Howard has a question.
On the application form on First Coast, it says application type 855 ROIBA or 20134. Which one is the right application?
Let me pull up their website. They have a dedicated website to those advanced payments, and there should be a single dedicated form.
But it just doesn't say which application form type you're supposed to use.
All right, so I'm looking at it now. And I can go over this with you, but are you seeing the check your reason for the request box? Is that what you're looking at under the there's
application type?
The specific form here, and this is on. I'll send you the URL. There's one link to one form that I see, which is accelerated and advanced payment form. And then it just has the instructions for it, the reason that you want to apply, which would be, delay and there's one related to COVID-19 that's pretty straightforward. And then I don't see any other forms on their website, but let me send you a link to the form that I am looking at now so that we can make sure we're on the same page. And if for whatever reason they have any in for other, if they have multiple forms or anything confusing on their page, I have a good rapport with First Coast. We can work that out with them, and in addition to you in touch with anybody else to walk you through it on their end. But I will send you the page I'm looking at, which only appears to have this one form. But again, they're also in a situation where I know that they've rolled this out very quickly. So if there are ambiguities with respect to how to apply on their website, we'll make sure we get that figured out for you. I'll help you with that.
Okay, thanks.
Well, we have 2 minutes left. Dr. Falcone has a question.
I was just wondering if there's anything we're doing specifically in Florida to ensure that we have enough PPE for our healthcare workers. I know there's been a lot of issues with this in New York, and as we're anticipating to see more cases, I was just wondering if we're doing anything to prepare for that.
Well, Dr. Giffler, we have been working with the Department of Health to locate any PPE available in private practices and such. We sent out a survey this last week in the FMA News and have been in close contact with the Department of Health as far as anything that we can do to help.
Well, it's 2:00. I think that's quitting time. Thank you all very much. To be continued, unfortunately.